Sometimes one mistake is enough to ruin your plans to become world champion. The game I'm about to show you features a truly heartbreaking moment. One player had it almost in the bag, with a candidate's tournament spot within his reach. Win this and he'd have a shot at the world title. But sometimes a single lapse in concentration is all it takes. Let this game be a lesson in chess and in life. Let's analyze. So this game basically decided who will get the second place in the Grand Swiss tournament recently held in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. And the top two finishers in that tournament would go on to qualify for the candidates tournament, which determines who will fight the current world chess champion for the chess crown. So that's a complicated, long system. 2 years, chess players compete to get a chance to fight for the chess crown. And one of those players was one of the favorites to win the event. Vincent Keymer, he's currently one of the top 10 chess players in the world. Very talented, young German. But he was facing his compatriot, who is maybe not as highly rated, but a very, very strong and menacing chess player who has defeated lots of top GMs in that very same Grand Swiss tournament, Matthias Blübaum. And Matthias would not roll over and die to let his compatriot fight in the candidates tournament. Matthias wanted to fight in the candidates himself. Let's see this crazy battle and the heartbreaking finish to it. So we get this opening. This is something that Vincent quite often plays, those systems with g3. He also likes going b3. He likes to play variations where there is not too much theory, and I appreciate that. I also am of a similar approach, but much lower rated, of course, than Vincent. And here he plays knight c3, which is a weird move. I think it has been played in practice, but it's very rare because usually white pushes the pawn to c4 first and then develops the knight here, because white wants to use this bishop, the light squared bishop, and that's why c4 is useful to try to attack the d5 square. But knight c3 escapes the realms of theory completely. Now Matthias thought for some time and decided to go d4, attacking the knight, a logical move, and now knight e4. You can see by the time usage that Matthias is out of his prep and Vincent is still in his prep, blitzing his moves. With every move he gets plus 30 seconds increment, so he gets even more time with those moves than he spends on them. So he's moving instantaneously, almost. c5, logical move, strengthening the center for black. And now e3. e3 chipping away at the center, and also white wants to undouble those doubled e-pawns. So okay, knight c6, trades. And now knight d2. This is already like probably the first move for for Vincent that he made, being out of his book, out of his prep. This looks a bit weird, but white wants to kick the knight from d4, and white wants to win this game to qualify for the candidates. That's why he doesn't go for the exchanges, which would very likely have led to a draw. Even though still after e5, white is somewhat better, a little bit pushing due to this bishop that is already developed, and that one is not. But most likely it would be a draw here. So instead, Vincent thought for a long time and retreated, trying to avoid simplifications. b6, e5. Now the rook is attacked, so instead of moving it, black goes bishop a6, counter-attacking white's rook. So both rooks can be taken now, but actually what's funny is that from afar I thought that black would take here, but no, black would take here. That's the idea. Sacrificing the rook. And now, after rook e1, bishop b7, white is up in exchange, but look at this long diagonal. Black will destroy white over there, probably with a checkmating attack, with a checkmate on g2 with the queen. So that would have been nice idea, going bishop a6 here by Matthias. Rook a1 is what white chooses. Rook c8. Now this rook no longer can be taken. c3, kicking the knight back, the knight drops back. Queen a4. This is the part of the game where Vincent Keymer tries to poke and prod and somehow claim an advantage with white, attacking the bishop first of all, and then rotating the queen to g4, putting pressure on the king side. Potentially, if white manages to put the bishop on h6, that would be unpleasant. And it's a good rule of thumb in chess if you have a pawn on e5 with white, you can and you should most likely attack on the king side, which is what Vincent Keymer, being a classically trained chess player, which is exactly what he does. If white has a pawn on d5, usually it's good to attack on the queen side. So you should know this if you don't. b5. Black tries to strike back on the queen side, potentially attacking over there, but this creates also some weaknesses for black. Whenever you move a pawn, you create potentially some weakened squares. So a4 is generally useful to trade and get the a file for your rook, but not now. Knight f3 first. Vincent keeps his eye on attacking on the king side, as I already told you. So king h8 side steps potentially, because otherwise bishop h6 would be a threat with a pinned g-pawn. Now it's no longer possible, but queen h5 is what white chooses, wanting to put the knight here to checkmate black. Queen e8, and now takes, and bishop g5. Apparently knight g5 would have been even better according to the engine, but I don't see anything concrete. So bishop g5 is also logical. If black takes, white will take with a knight, adding another attacker into the game. But instead black goes f6. Black wants to trade the queens because black realizes that otherwise there's a high chance that white checkmates black. So takes, and now bishop h6, and Matthias has gained some advantage. The engine says it's almost +1. Why? Because those pawns are weak. Those pawns on f6, e6, b5, c5, and because probably there is a bit more pressure from the white side to the black side. The rooks are very nice for white. The bishop is nice on h6. This bishop is potentially very dangerous. So that's why the engine likes white more. But it's still a fight. Knight d8. Rook a5, putting pressure over there. Now the b5 pawn is hanging, so b4, c4. Now the c5 pawn will potentially be a weakness. Bear that in mind, because that's exactly what will play an important role in this game. Knight f7 attacks this bishop, the bishop drops back and puts more pressure on c5. Now there are two attackers and two defenders of c5, so black's rook cannot go there, for example, in many variations, because this pawn will be hanging. That is why black goes rook a8, exactly that move. Because if you take with the rook, you will get taken with the bishop. So you have to waste some time trading, first of all, and then trying to somehow get another piece to attack c5. Because c5 is a weakness, you need to attack it. That's also an important positional chess principle. Knight d2. We trade the bishops, and rook a2. Now black says that white also has a weakness on b2 that can be attacked, but knight a4 is what white chooses. So here Vincent gambles. He gives up the b2 pawn. Now black has a menacing passed pawn on the b file, protected passed pawn, very close to queen. But white is quite confident that white can have the play of its own. And here Vincent finds, in my opinion, a great move. I really enjoyed it. Rook a1. Instead of just trading, which would be my logical choice, take. Now putting pressure over here, but it's a draw. It's a draw according to the engine in many lines. Black can give up this e6 pawn, for example. Taking here is also possible, but even better is b3, and black has sufficient counterplay here. But instead of taking this pawn, white doesn't take the pawn. White activates the rook, and white says that I will infiltrate, and it will not be pleasant for black. And it really is unpleasant. Here Matthias made a series of not optimal moves. King g7, activating the king, but an inaccuracy according to the engine. Now rook e7 creates potentially very dangerous pins, and king f8 was necessary here, but instead Matthias went bishop f8, and after bishop c5, this was the worst of the inaccuracies that he made. He should have pushed b3, but instead he took this bishop, and that leaves white with a close to winning advantage. Why? Because this pawn is hanging, and if you just move it forward, you get knight e4. A great maneuver. Maybe black hasn't spotted it. The idea is to put the knight on d6 and win this pinned knight. So after knight to e4, the only way to save from the pin is king g6, because if king j8, then this pawn falls. So king g6, but then rook a6. Maybe this is the move that Matthias missed, and now it's impossible for black to not lose this pawn. And I remember seeing the video where Matthias is like banging the table, furious at himself. How could I like not see this? Because if he gets a draw in this game, he most likely goes to the candidates. If Vincent wins this game, Vincent goes to the candidates. So very, very, very intense moment. So of course white is close to winning, but the game goes on. Rook c2. Now black has the only chance to create something by pushing his pawn. Yes, black loses one of the pawns, check. And now rook c6 defends this. b3, c5, b2, rook b6. White is in time to both hold this pawn from queening and not lose this pawn. That's very, very skillful technique by white. Knight d8 trying to maneuver somehow, knight d6, and now knight to e6. Here, black could have traded the c pawn for the d pawn, but that would have left them with a technically losing endgame. 2 versus 3, not connected 2 pawns versus not connected 3 pawns in such an endgame most likely is a win for the white side. So knight e6 instead of the trade black waits. Knight f5 check, and now knight e3. The rook is attacked, and unfortunately for black now has to trade, take here and allow this pawn to be captured, because if black persists in not taking, c6 happens, and now white gets counterplay of its own, and sooner rather than later, most likely black will have to somehow untangle and trade the b pawn for the c pawn. So because of this, rook takes c5 and rook b2 happens here, and we get an endgame that is technically winning for white. But if only it were so easy. It's not easy at all. To win a winning endgame is one of the most difficult things in chess. Vincent Keymer first proceeded to do everything with surgical precision. So after h5, he goes rook b4, controlling this side of the board, preventing any h4 counterplay. And after knight d4, he decides to put the pawn on h4. It's a very good way to position your pawns in an endgame. This diagonal file of 3 pawns, f2, g3, h4, always good, practically always good. Black has some counterplay, but long term, black has 2 weaknesses, h5 and e5 pawns, and they will fall. And most likely white will win this game. Or will he win this game? King e6, check. King here, knight f1. The knight wants to go probably here. Great square. Knight f5, knight e2, rook c2, knight e4. Now the knight is on an outpost. It cannot be attacked by any of black's pawns, since black doesn't have the d and f pawns. Rook e2 attacks the knight, but the knight just drops back. And now is the critical moment in the game. White is still winning, check, and white goes rook h7, automatically falling asleep at the wheel. When everything is already done, you're like almost arrived at your destination, but you fell asleep at the wheel and you crash after the brilliant knight g3. And this move guarantees that Matthias Bluebaum will make a draw against Vincent Keymer, and that Vincent Keymer loses almost all of his chances to qualify for the candidates this year. Most likely he will qualify for the candidates in the next cycle, maybe even in this cycle if he wins the World Cup. But yeah, it was painful. It was heartbreaking. I remember the emotions of players. Matthias was in disbelief that he somehow saved this game, and Vincent was obviously saddened by this. So the idea of knight takes g3, it's a simple trap. The idea is that you can't take obviously with the pawn because it's pinned. You can only take with the king, but then you get forked. And somehow black has managed to trade the knight for a knight and a pawn. And this endgame will be, of course, a drawn one. Instead of this, after knight g3, instead of taking, white first checks black, the king drops back, now knight b1 attacks the rook, but there's just rook b2, still this knight is under attack, so takes, rook h5, and even though white is up one pawn, white could be up 2 pawns, so this is a theoretically drawn endgame. The f and h pawns in a rook endgame make a draw, if your opponent knows what to do, and Matthias Blübaum does know what to do, let me assure you. So check, he goes here, he goes here, he goes here, and they don't even play it out, they agree to a draw. In this moment, because Vincent realizes he cannot win this drawn endgame, it's a dead drawn. So kudos to Matthias, fantastic play by him, and congrats on getting into the candidates. Do you think I should record a podcast episode with Matthias Blübaum? If you want me to do it, please drop a comment, and hopefully we'll make it happen. See you in the next one. Bye bye.